Some of you have no doubt heard the story about the nun who was primarily responsible for visiting and caring for the members in her town that were in the nursing home. And she was on her way to visit one day when, as luck would have it, or lack of luck would have it, she ran out of gas. But fortunately, she was just a block or two from the gas station, so she walked down and asked them if they had a loaner can. After all, she just needed enough gas to get to the station and fill up. And they told her that they were sorry, but they had just loaned out the only can that they had. But if she would wait a little while, it would be back, and they'd be glad to let her have it. But she was in a hurry and didn't want to wait, so she went back to her car and started rummaging through it, looking for anything that would hold enough gas to just get her to the gas station. And the only thing that she could find was a bedpan. Well, it'll work. So she carried it to the gas station, put a little gasoline in it, and carried it back to her car. And when she was pouring that into her gas tank, two men happened to be walking by. One looked at the other and said, "Man, I want to tell you, that is faith." Did you notice that Jesus looked at this woman and declared that she had a great faith? Of all the people in the Bible, this is the one time that he praises a person for having a great, great faith. We sing about, I try to preach about, amazing grace. And that's a glorious thing, isn't it? And I don't think you can play Amazing Grace in a way that I don't enjoy. That God's grace would reach all the way down to each of us is an amazing thing. I love to tell people about God's amazing grace. But have you ever stopped to think about that? Amazing grace calls for an amazing faith. After this lady had experienced some encouragement from Jesus, she expressed amazing faith. If you were standing before God right now, what would He have to say about your faith? You know, we're good at offering excuses, all kinds of them. But of all of the people, humanly speaking, in the Bible, this lady was one of the least likely to express a tremendous kind of faith in Jesus Christ, but she did. And I think that is the reason that God moved upon these men to record this event for us today. And let's look at this story as it unfolds and see what it is that marks an amazing faith. First, note the privacy in verse 24. There was this desire for some rest and recuperation. Now, I know there's no need at all for me to back up, but I mentioned in Mark chapter 6 last week that Jesus and the disciples wanted to get away for a little while. You remember that, right? So they got in a boat on the Sea of Galilee, but it didn't work, did it? Because crowds followed them as the boat went along and even grew in numbers. They're still looking for a little time to get away. They needed rest and they needed recuperation and renewal. And we're going to see that by the rudeness of the disciples. But notice the phrase in Mark there in verse 24, he could not escape notice. Everywhere that Jesus went, they seemed to know who he was, and crowds began to gather. Mark, more than any of the other Gospels, point out that Jesus, not only did he not encourage, he discouraged great crowds from following him. Literally, volumes have been written on the secrecy of Mark. Why did Jesus do that? Well, perhaps one reason is that he did not want to be accused of starting an uprising, which later he was and was the primary reason, the primary excuse that he was crucified. But there's something else going on here. We looked at this on a Wednesday night. Jesus had just had a clash with the religious folks of his day over hand washing. They wanted to know why Jesus and his disciples ate without washing their hands. And it wasn't that they were dirty, they had a prescribed way to wash their hands to be ritually clean. And Jesus said, dummies, that's what it says in the Greek. You dummies, it's not what you eat that defiles you, even if it is possum on a stick. It's what comes out of your mouth. That's what defiles you. And here he's going into a Gentile territory immediately following this clash. You know what it's saying? Jesus is telling them and us, I'm not going to get defiled by going into this Gentile territory. And it says something about us, that even Gentiles can be saved by the grace of God and become children of God. So he's going into this Gentile territory. And look at the person that he encounters. This is where I want us to look at Mark and Matthew. In Mark says that, as I pointed out, she was a Greek. Now what does that mean? Not by birth, because we're told her origin. It means that she spoke Greek. But more than that, maybe you've seen this in some of your Sunday school material, she was Hellenized. Means that in her speaking, in her language, in her customs, she was thoroughly Greek. One thing about the Greeks, they had a God for everything. I mean, you talk about polytheistic. Some of you may have toured the Parthenon in Nashville. It's a replica of the one in Greece. And there's all kinds of little figures all the way around that building and inside that building. You know what all of those statues and figures are? Gods. I mean, they had a God for rain, a God for sunshine, a God for thunder. They had a God for everything. That was this woman's background. And it's been my experience, that's one of the most difficult things to deal with. A number of years ago, I was in an area that a man had married a girl from Vietnam, and she expressed an interest in church and started witnessing to her, and she accepted Jesus, and I was all excited, and I talked to a preacher friend that had been there about 15 years before, and he said, yep, she did the same thing with me. See, she was Buddhist. And they have all kinds of gods. So one more God, that's no problem. That's what she grew up in. She's called a Syrophenician. Man, what on earth is that? That describes the territory, northwest coastal area, Syria/Phoenicia. What's important about it? The historian Josephus. Now, don't get him confused with Bocephus, the singer, all right? Josephus lived in the time of Christ. He was a historian, and he wrote this about the Phoenicians. They were notoriously our bitterest enemies. Now, Matthew says that she was from Tyre and Sidon instead of just Tyre. That describes, too, the territory. Much like we use the phrase, well, I live in the Nashville-Franklin area. I live in Nashville-Murfreesboro area. Something to that effect. But he tells us something completely different. He tells us her historical roots. Did you catch it? A Canaanite. You read the Old Testament, and those Canaanites are the oldest, bitterest enemies of the children of Israel. Now, what does all this mean? Well, just kind of put it together. No offense, ladies, but a woman had 2 strikes against her anyway. She was a foreign woman, Greek-speaking, polytheistic, age-old enemy of the Jews. You see what I meant when I said she was the least likely candidate in all the world to express faith in Jesus Christ? Now, what does that mean to you and me this morning? We understand, usually, that God's grace is sufficient, no matter our background, no matter our culture, no matter what we've done, right? But do you also understand That no matter what your background, no matter what you've done, no matter where you've been, you can still exemplify an amazing faith in Jesus Christ. You see, the first lie of the devil is going to come along if you're lost and say, you can't be saved. But then when we begin to understand it's God's grace that's sufficient and we're saved, he said, well, you can't do anything. Just look at what's in your past. Just look at what you've done. Just look at what you've been. She exemplified an amazing faith. And when you begin to look at the details of the story, it's even more amazing. Look at the proclamation, what she said about Jesus in Matthew, latter part of 22 through 25. She calls him Son of David. What's significant about that? You see, Matthew, more than any of the other Gospels, wants us to understand that Jesus was the long-awaited Jewish Messiah. Son of David is a messianic title. Now, Jesus had just been fussed at by those religious leaders of his day for not washing his hands right. And here is a pagan, Greek-speaking, polytheistic woman acknowledging that he is the longed-for Messiah. Not only that, she acknowledges him as Savior. Now, it's true, you can read that front ways, back ways, sideways, and you won't see the word Savior in there. But she's come and she is making a plea that he would literally save her little girl. She's looking at him as a Savior. Isn't it amazing that here she was with everything against her, but she knew where to go to find the cure for her problem? She knew that her only hope was Jesus. Oh, but it gets even better. Look at the persistence here. This is the reason I wanted to read Matthew. Look at something in 22 and 23 again. You may have read this a number of times and overlooked this particular event. A Canaanite woman from that region came out and began to cry out, saying, participle, have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter's cruelly demon-possessed. She was saying it over and over and over again. Now look at the first part of verse 23. And he did not answer her a word. Can you picture that? I have difficulty picturing it. She was begging and begging and begging, and Jesus appeared to be oblivious to her pleas. Sometimes silence can be the loudest voice of rejection you'll ever hear. Can you use your imagination this morning? You're going to have to use your imagination, because I know if you've married, you've never had a fuss. But just imagine that you've had the fuss of all fusses with your spouse. I mean, it was a good one. And you turn to your spouse and you say, but do you still love me? Nothing. You hear that? Nothing. God forbid you go to the doctor. He comes in with all of his papers and got a concerned look on his face and said, I'm sorry, I've got some bad news for you. And you say, but I'm going to be all right, aren't I, doctor? And you hear nothing. What does that nothing say? Go home and make your arrangements to die. She pleads and she pleads and she hears nothing. Wow. Jesus ignoring her. And it gets worse. I told you the disciples needed some rest. She kept pleading, and the disciples say, tell her to leave us alone. Who was she asking for help? Where's the us in there? That's like we killed a bear, but Papa shot it, right? Leave us, tell her to just leave us alone. She's annoying. Did she give up? Nah, she didn't give up. Finally, Jesus answered. And he said, it's not right to take the children's food and give it to the dogs until the children have eaten. And she said, oh, first the children are fed. You said first. Even being second is good enough. She picks up on that second and says, even the dogs get some crumbs. Jesus, just a crumb will do. I want to tell you, she's expressing profound humility here. She accepts the title dog. You know what she's saying? Jesus, I understand that I have no right to demand your grace, your mercy. I am basing my plea upon you. You see, I'm afraid we hear so much about God's grace, we think He owes it to us. No, He doesn't. And she expresses that it's not my right, I'm begging for your grace. But there's a slight change here. She said, you don't feed the children's food to the dogs. Mom, would you take your toddler's food and feed the dog and let the child go hungry? Not much of a mom would do that, would they? But there's a word here that I didn't see a single translation hardly that picked up on it. You see, a dog in that day was not your thoroughbreds, were not your pets. They were these mean old junkyard dogs. They were wild scavengers. They were despised and hated. In the Old Testament, dogs often refer to homosexuals. In the New Testament, they refer to Gentiles. And it was a derogatory remark. And she accepted that title, but Jesus uses a diminutive term here, a little dog.